They said the Mustang was unbreakable. They said no one could even get close without a rope or a whip. They said it would take a miracle. And then an 11-year-old girl walked into the arena, silent, trembling, holding nothing but a notebook, and everything changed. No one expected her to speak. She hadn't spoken since the accident, the fall from her favorite pony that left her not just with broken bones, but with a silence so deep even her teacher stopped trying. Her voice had vanished like it had galloped off into the woods that day, and it hadn't come back. And yet there she was, Grace Johnson, standing at the edge of the training pen where Misty, the rogue silver dapple Mustang, had already sent 3 professional trainers scrambling for safety in the last week alone. The horse had been captured from the wilds of Echo Canyon, untouched by humans, fierce, proud, and completely unwilling to be tamed. Misty wasn't just another wild horse. She had become a symbol of failure. Trainers whispered about her late at night, said she was cursed, dangerous, unpredictable. Her file at the stables had red ink warnings stamped across it. Misty was the kind of horse ranchers gave up on, and she was the kind of horse collectors offered to buy with plans to keep her locked up in isolation as a rare trophy. Walter Bennett, the stable owner, knew Misty was his last shot at drawing attention to the festival that might save his struggling business. But every day she refused the saddle, refused the halter, refused even a kind voice or a gentle hand. The odds stacked higher against him. That morning, the sun barely cleared the ridge when Grace arrived at the stables. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Her presence alone startled the early morning crew, still sweeping hay and prepping feed. She made her way quietly, deliberately, to the fence. The Mustang stood at the far end of the pen, snorting, pawing at the earth, tail flicking with irritation. Grace said nothing. She didn't call to the horse, didn't whistle, didn't make a move to approach. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the grass just outside the enclosure, pulled a pencil from behind her ear, opened her notebook, and began to draw. To everyone watching from the barn, it looked like she was wasting time. Just a little girl sketching while a storm of muscle and wildness paced 20 feet away. But Misty noticed. She always noticed everything. Her ears turned. Her eyes tracked the strange, quiet figure. She didn't rear up like she had with the others, didn't charge the fence. She watched. Charlotte Bennett, Walter's daughter, leaned on the post nearby and whispered to her dad, "She's not even trying." But Walter, who had known Grace's family for years, saw something else. There was no fear in the girl's posture, no tension in her shoulders, just calm, deliberate stillness, as if she belonged there, as if she was waiting for the horse to come to her on its own. And then the impossible happened. Misty, without any command, without any pressure, took a step closer. One slow, cautious step, then another. She didn't pin her ears or throw her head like before. She moved like someone unsure but curious. Every muscle in the stables froze. Grace didn't even look up. She just kept drawing, humming the barest melody under her breath, a sound so soft you'd miss it if the wind blew. By the time the Mustang was standing just 10 feet away, no one could believe it. Misty had never approached anyone before. Not like this, not on her own. And that's when Grace finally looked up, their eyes meeting for a single, loaded second. There was no fear in Grace's gaze, only something steady, warm, and completely open. The Mustang didn't bolt. She didn't flinch. She blinked slowly and lowered her head, lowered it until her nose was level with the grass just inches from the fence. Grace set her notebook down, stood slowly, and extended her hand. It shook ever so slightly, not from fear but something else. Hope, maybe. Memory. Trust. And Misty took one step closer, one final step. Her breath, warm and even, reached Grace's fingers. And then, in a move that left hardened ranchers and veteran trainers choking on tears, Misty pressed her muzzle gently into the girl's palm. It lasted only a moment, but in that moment, the air changed. The entire stable stood still, and the story of a broken girl and an untamable horse was no longer about what couldn't be done. It was about what happens when you stop trying to control and start trying to understand. The day after that first impossible touch, the energy at Bennett's stables shifted like the wind before a storm. Word had spread through town faster than gossip at the diner. By breakfast, everyone from horse trainers to curious neighbors had heard the same whispered phrase. The Mustang let the Johnson girl touch her. Most brushed it off as a fluke, an accident, nothing more than a lucky moment in a week filled with disappointment. But a few, especially those who'd seen it with their own eyes, couldn't stop replaying it, couldn't explain it, couldn't ignore it. Walter Bennett, pacing in the main barn with coffee he'd long forgotten to drink, wasn't sure what to think. All he knew was that something had shifted, and he wasn't ready to give up on it just yet. When Grace arrived early that morning, the sun was still low enough to paint the stable yard in amber light. Her notebook was under one arm, a small cooler in the other. Evelyn dropped her off with a few quiet words and a concerned glance before heading off for her morning errands. Walter, watching from the loft window, noted the girl's serious expression. She didn't dawdle, didn't look around. She headed straight to Misty's pen. The Mustang was already awake, alert, ears flicking forward the moment Grace came into view. She stood near the fence, not as distant as before, her posture wary but unmistakably interested. That was all the encouragement Grace needed. She moved to her now familiar spot near the edge of the pen, unfolded a small blanket, and sat down. From her cooler, she pulled out a few apple slices and carrots, placing them carefully, not close enough for Misty to reach, but close enough to be seen and smelled. She didn't offer them, didn't coax or tempt. She simply placed them there and returned to her drawing, her body language unthreatening, passive but grounded with purpose. As the morning progressed, others began to gather. Philip Turner, the veteran trainer with decades of calluses and horse scars, arrived first, muttering about having seen everything now. Dr. Adams, the veterinarian who had monitored Misty's health since her capture, came shortly after, her curiosity piqued more by the behavioral implications than any talk of taming. Charlotte wandered over next, arms crossed, unsure whether to be impressed or skeptical. Even Frank, the old stable hand who rarely spoke unless absolutely necessary, kept one eye on the pen as he shoveled hay. "What's she doing?" Philip finally asked, breaking the silence. "She's not training. She's just sitting." "She's being there," Dr. Adams replied without looking away from the scene. "She's letting Misty watch her. No commands, no ropes, no pressure. That's not nothing. That's exactly what Misty's never had before." Still, to most of the adults, it looked like inactivity, a waste of precious time. Misty had 6 weeks before the Springvale Horse Festival, and Walter needed results, proof that the stables had something worth showcasing, something that could attract sponsors, tourists, and desperately needed revenue. Yet Grace made no moves to accelerate anything. She kept her presence consistent, her movements slow, her focus on her sketchbook and the mare's subtle responses. Misty, in turn, crept closer, inch by inch, hour by hour, until by midday she was grazing calmly within a few yards of Grace's spot. What none of the onlookers understood, at least not yet, was that Grace was building something, not obedience, not dominance. She was building permission. She was inviting the Mustang to choose connection, to step forward not because she had to, but because she wanted to, and Misty was beginning to want it. By afternoon, the stable yard had a small crowd. Curious townsfolk leaned on fences and peered through railings. A few children from the nearby elementary school snuck peeks between errands. Even Dylan Parker, the classmate who'd once teased Grace for her silence, showed up with his mom, claiming he'd just been passing by. But it was clear he wanted to see if the stories were true. "She's still not doing anything," Charlotte whispered to her father. "I don't get it." Walter didn't answer at first. He watched as Misty lowered her head, sniffed an apple slice near the fence, then turned her eyes toward Grace, just for a moment. That flicker of attention, that silent exchange. He'd trained horses his whole life. He knew how long it took to gain that kind of trust. if it came at all. "She's doing more than you think," he finally said. "She's listening, and Misty's answering." Around 3 o'clock, something happened that no one could explain away. Grace, still humming softly, placed another slice of apple slightly closer to the fence, closer than ever before. Misty stood still for nearly 5 full minutes, her muscles tense with indecision. Then, in a slow, deliberate movement, she stepped forward and took the treat. Not snatched, not lunged. She took it gently, carefully, and then she stayed. No running, no flinching. She stood there while Grace calmly sketched her, the space between them no longer a wall, but a bridge. Philip muttered something under his breath. Frank just shook his head in disbelief. Charlotte's mouth fell open, then shut quickly when she realized her dad had noticed. And Dylan? Dylan was wide-eyed, silent, maybe for the first time in his life. The day ended with Misty lying down near the edge of her pen while Grace packed up her things. It was the first time anyone had seen the mare rest in full view of people, her legs tucked calmly beneath her, her eyes half-lidded with drowsy peace. Grace paused before leaving, writing one last note and handing it to Walter as Evelyn pulled up to drive her home. "She's starting to feel safe," the note said. "Tomorrow, I'll bring music." Walter folded the paper gently, as if it was something sacred, because maybe, in a way, it was. Maybe this whole strange, quiet journey was something sacred, and maybe, just maybe, a girl who hadn't spoken in years had already said more through her silence than the rest of them ever could with words. By the third morning, Springvale was no longer whispering about Grace and Misty. They were talking. At the diner, conversations paused whenever someone brought up the Mustang. Kids at school traded theories about how Grace had managed to touch a wild horse. At the post office, even the grumpiest locals debated whether the silent girl could actually tame the untamable. The Johnson name, once mentioned with hushed sympathy after the accident, was now spoken with cautious wonder. And yet, through all this growing attention, Grace remained unchanged, focused, uninterested in anything but returning to the stables and sitting, once again, beside Misty's pen. She didn't need the town's approval. She needed Misty to feel safe, and that meant showing up again and again, the same way, with the same patience. Walter was already in the barn when she arrived that day, raking the last of the morning hay into neat piles. He greeted her with a nod, less formal now, more impressed, though he'd never say it out loud. Grace set up in her usual spot without a word, but today she brought something new. From her backpack, she carefully removed a small wooden flute. It wasn't fancy, simple and worn from use, but as soon as she held it to her lips and played the first few soft, wandering notes, something in the air shifted. Misty, who had been pacing quietly at the far side of her pen, froze mid-step. Her ears perked toward the sound, her eyes narrowing in quiet focus. Grace continued, the notes slow and deliberate, as if feeling out Misty's breathing. The melody wasn't anything recognizable, a gentle, improvised tune, but it flowed like water around the tension in the pen, wrapping around the Mustang's skittish energy and softening it. No one watching quite understood what they were witnessing, but everyone felt it. Philip arrived halfway through the session carrying a pail of water, only to pause at the sight. "She's playing music to it now?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "What's next? Bedtime stories?" "She's not playing to her," Dr. Adams replied, who had also arrived earlier, drawn by a growing curiosity she could no longer dismiss. "She's playing with her. There's a difference." Frank chuckled quietly from the side of the barn. "Been here 40 years, he said. "Never seen anything like it." The Mustang didn't bolt, didn't rear or snort or retreat. Instead, Misty slowly lowered herself to the ground, legs folding beneath her like a house cat settling in for a nap. Grace never stopped playing. Her body remained relaxed, her eyes focused only on the sky. The music was a gift, and Misty was choosing to accept it. Walter leaned against the fence, arms folded, trying to make sense of it all. He wasn't a man who gave in to feelings easily, but watching that wild animal choose peace, if only for a moment, stirred something inside him. Something that reminded him of his late wife, who'd once told him that some creatures don't come when called, they come when they're heard. As the music faded into silence, Misty lifted her head and let out a long, slow breath. She didn't rise immediately. She didn't panic. She just watched Grace, as if trying to decide what kind of creature this quiet girl truly was. By mid-morning, the unofficial observers started rolling in again. A few more townspeople, a journalist from the county paper, Dylan Parker, again, this time with two of his friends trailing behind, whispering and jostling each other until Grace's stillness and Misty's focused presence hushed them like a spell. Dr. Adams stepped forward to speak with Walter quietly. "I've been thinking," she said, "about something Grace wrote the other day, that everyone tries to make Misty obey, but no one tries to understand her. That's not just a child's intuition. That's behavior theory. That's empathy-based conditioning. She's using what we call pressure-free presence, and it's working." Walter nodded, eyes still on the girl and the horse. "She's not training her like we do. She's just being with her, like they're equals." "They are equals, Doctor," Adams said. "Two wounded souls who know what it means to be afraid of being misunderstood." The day unfolded with more small miracles. Misty began approaching the fence more often, standing nearby while Grace sketched or played her flute, even sniffing at the familiar cooler where treats were kept. Grace, for her part, never rushed, never reached out. She waited for every inch to be earned, every breath shared to be voluntary. She wrote notes in her sketchbook between drawings, observations on Misty's posture, how her ears flicked during certain sounds, how she tensed at unexpected noises. Grace wasn't just watching the horse. She was learning her language, one silent exchange at a time. By late afternoon, a ripple of surprise swept through the crowd. Misty took 3 slow steps toward Grace and stopped, close enough to touch. But Grace didn't reach for her. Instead, she gently placed an apple slice on the ground between them and lowered her eyes. She wasn't offering a command, she was offering trust. Misty sniffed the ground, looked at Grace, then took the apple, and didn't leave. She stood there, still, calm, present. For the first time, the two were not just coexisting, they were together. When Evelyn arrived to pick Grace up, she found her granddaughter still sitting beside the pen, quietly humming, Misty just feet away, ears forward and eyes soft. Evelyn said nothing at first, just stood with Walter and watched. "That horse is going to change this town," she said quietly. Walter didn't take his eyes off the pen. "No," he replied, "that girl already has." The next day began with a thick blanket of morning mist hanging low over Springvale, softening the edges of fences and fields, and giving the stable yard an almost dreamlike stillness. Grace arrived before the sun had fully crested over Hawk's Peak, her notebook tucked under one arm, a cooler swinging gently from her other hand. She walked with quiet purpose, her boots dampened by dew, her braids slightly unraveling from the morning chill. Walter spotted her from the main barn, surprised but not entirely. She was always early now. The girl who once kept to herself was becoming as much a fixture of Bennett's stables as the weathered hitching posts and the dusty red barn doors. Grace set herself up as usual, beside Misty's pen, but this time she didn't immediately sit down or pull out her flute. She stood at the fence for a long moment, simply watching. Misty stood too, alert but calm, ears flicked forward in recognition, eyes soft. They had reached a new phase, one not defined by fear or challenge, but by acknowledgement. Misty knew Grace was coming back, and today something between them felt more deliberate, less like curiosity and more like readiness. Walter approached from behind, carrying a halter and lead rope out of habit. "She's calm," he remarked, glancing at the Mustang, then at Grace. "Seems to be expecting you." Grace nodded and wrote quickly in her notebook. "Can I try going inside the pen today?" The question hung in the air. Walter rubbed the back of his neck, considering it. "I don't know, Grace. It's a big step." He paused, then added, "Let me talk to Dr. Adams first." Within the hour, Dr. Adams arrived, her boots still muddy from a farm call. She read Grace's note and listened to Walter's concern before walking slowly toward the pen to observe Misty. The Mustang looked over at Grace, then at the vet, her body relaxed, not a trace of the tension she'd shown in her early days of captivity. After a few minutes, Dr. Adams turned to them. "We don't go in fully," she said, "but maybe it's time we try something in between." They devised a plan. Frank and Philip helped modify Misty's pen, creating a temporary section separated by a sturdy metal gate. It wasn't much, just an enclosed space where Grace could be with Misty, but not in with her, enough to build a new layer of trust without pushing too far too fast. Grace agreed, writing, "She'll tell me when she's ready. I'll listen." That afternoon, the setup was ready. Grace entered the newly sectioned part of the pen, her body language calm, her movements slow and predictable. She brought her chair and her flute, and this time she sat directly beside the dividing gate. Misty watched from the other side, curious but hesitant, her eyes flicking between Grace and the objects she carried. Grace didn't push for more. She simply began playing again, the same soft melody as before, while Misty stood listening, her ears twitching with every note. It wasn't long before the first townspeople showed up. Word had spread, again. The local librarian arrived with a camera, followed by Dylan's mom, who brought muffins, just in case anyone was hungry. Then came a pair of teachers from the elementary school. Within an hour, a small group had formed by the fence line, not shouting, not crowding, just watching, quietly, respectfully. Grace barely noticed. Her focus remained on Misty, who had now stepped closer to the gate than ever before. The mare didn't retreat when Grace shifted slightly in her seat or adjusted her flute. Instead, she remained, ears forward, head low, eyes blinking slowly, the universal language of trust. Charlotte showed up around midday with a paper bag lunch from the house. "Dad said you'd forget to eat," she told Grace, handing it through the outer gate. Grace smiled softly, accepting the food, and scribbled a quick thank you before returning her attention to Misty. Charlotte lingered, sitting down beside Grace for the first time without a hint of her usual skepticism. "She's really watching you now," Charlotte whispered after a while, "like she's trying to figure out what kind of person you are." Grace wrote a response and passed the notebook to her. "I'm trying to figure her out too. We're both still deciding." Later in the afternoon, Dr. Adams returned to check on Misty's progress. "She's approaching more freely," she observed, "and her heartbeat stays steady even when Grace moves. That's new." As the day wore on, Misty finally walked up to the dividing gate and stood quietly. Grace looked at her, not directly into her eyes, but at the bridge of her nose, offering calm. Then, with one slow, deliberate motion, Grace extended her hand, not to touch, but to offer a carrot slice just beyond the bars. Misty didn't flinch. She sniffed the air, stretched her neck forward, and gently took the offering from Grace's palm. Then she remained at the gate, her nostrils brushing the metal slats as if wanting more than just a treat. She was asking for connection, for presence. Grace slowly reached out again, this time holding nothing, just her open hand. Misty lowered her head, let her muzzle hover, then brushed against Grace's palm with the softest whisper of contact. A collective inhale rose from the crowd. Even Walter, who had been watching with guarded optimism, felt something shift inside him. Not just a breakthrough between horse and girl, but a moment that told him something bigger was happening here, something he hadn't planned, couldn't have predicted, but desperately needed to believe in. Frank broke the silence with a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he said. "That horse just said, 'I trust you.'" And Grace, ever observant, simply smiled, wrote a new line in her notebook and held it up. "Tomorrow, I want to try something new." Charlotte leaned over to peek at it. "What's that?" Grace wrote again, this time more deliberately, underlining each word. "I want to go in with her." The murmurs began immediately. Walter looked up sharply. Dr. Adams took a slow breath. Evelyn, who had just arrived with fresh lemonade, dropped the cup in her hand. "Absolutely not," she said, walking over quickly. "Grace, honey, you've come so far, but Misty is still unpredictable. She's still wild." Grace stood her ground, writing faster than ever. "She's not wild to me. She's afraid, like I was. But she won't hurt me. I know it." Philip folded his arms. "One touch through a gate doesn't mean you've tamed her. She's still a wild Mustang. It's too dangerous." Grace looked at Walter. Her expression wasn't pleading, it was certain. She wasn't asking for permission. She was asking to be trusted. Walter met her gaze, saw something in her eyes that reminded him of his late wife again, an unshakable belief in the power of quiet persistence. But before he could answer, Dr. Adams stepped forward. "What if we meet in the middle?" she suggested. "We expand the gate section. Give them space to interact more closely, but keep a barrier. It's not a full step in, but it's the next step toward trust." Grace hesitated, then nodded. She wrote one final note before the day ended, showing it to Evelyn, to Walter, and to Misty in turn. "She's ready, but I'll go slow, I promise." As the sun dipped low and the shadows grew long across the stable yard, Misty stood at the fence long after Grace left, her head lowered in the direction of the truck that carried the girl away. The wild Mustang no longer paced in panic, no longer kept her distance. Instead, she waited. And somewhere, in the still air of that waiting, Springvale found itself holding its breath, wondering if the impossible wasn't just possible, but already happening, quietly, between the beats of two hearts that had found one another in silence. The next morning unfolded with a nervous energy that felt different from the previous days, charged, like the hum of a thunderstorm far out on the horizon. Grace arrived earlier than usual, her breath visible in the crisp air, eyes sharp with purpose. She wasn't carrying her flute this time, nor her notebook, just a soft rope halter looped over her shoulder and a quiet determination in her step. Misty stood waiting near the middle of her pen, ears flicked forward, her eyes following Grace as she approached. There was no pacing, no tension in her muscles. She was expectant, as if she already knew that today would be different. Walter had already been there for an hour, making sure the modified gate system was working exactly as planned. Frank and Philip helped reinforce the expanded section, the one Grace had agreed to use, a safe in-between, with enough space for Misty to move freely, but still limited enough to keep any sudden reactions under control. Dr. Adams leaned on the nearby fence, arms crossed, watching every movement with the trained eye of someone who'd seen both miracles and mistakes. Charlotte stood quietly beside her father, clutching the thermos Grace had forgotten the day before. No one spoke much. There was nothing left to say. Today would either build the bridge or break the rhythm they'd all worked so carefully to create. Grace took a breath, unlatched the gate, and stepped inside. Not fully, not into the full pen, just the expanded section. She left the gate open behind her, a silent invitation. Misty turned toward her and took a step forward. No hesitation, no wide eyes, just interest. Grace didn't reach for her. She didn't move at all, just stood, grounded, her body relaxed but alert, her energy low and calm. Misty inched closer, her hooves silent on the packed dirt. The distance between them shortened in slow, careful movements, like a dance with no music, just the rhythm of trust, building one breath at a time. When Misty finally closed the distance, her nose was only inches from Grace's hand. She lowered her head slightly, and for the first time, Grace lifted the halter gently, letting it hang loose at her side, not pushing, just letting it be seen. Misty sniffed it, backed away half a step, then came forward again, more curious than wary. Grace waited, offering it to her as if saying, "Only if you want this." And for a moment, time seemed to fold inward, because Misty, the wild mare who once fought every inch of the fence, lowered her head again. And this time, when Grace moved slowly to lift the halter, Misty didn't pull back. She allowed the loop to pass over her ears, resting loosely around her neck like it had always belonged there. From the fence line, a soft collective gasp rose, too quiet to break the moment, but loud enough to feel like thunder. Charlotte grabbed her dad's arm. Dr. Adams blinked, once, slowly. Walter just stared, lips pressed tightly together, blinking hard as if he were trying not to show what he was feeling, but it was too late. Everyone could see it. This was no accident, no trick of timing. It was the result of something earned, something forged in silence and patience. Grace stepped back slowly, removed the halter again, then crouched low and sat. Not to train, not to coax, but just to be with her. Misty stayed close, lowering herself onto her knees, then curling her legs beneath her body, settling just a few feet from the girl who had become her anchor. It was Charlotte who finally whispered, "She's lying down." Dr. Adams nodded. "That's trust. She's not just calm, she's giving herself to the moment. That's the most vulnerable posture a horse can take. She's telling Grace, 'I'm safe with you.'" And Grace knew it too. She didn't move, didn't even blink too fast. Her heart was pounding, but not from fear. It was the pounding of recognition, of two beings that had learned to understand each other without ever needing words. The next few days were a blur of transformation. Grace began entering the pen regularly now, not just in the half section, but fully inside. At first it was just for short periods, then longer. Misty came to her willingly, nudging her softly, walking alongside her without a lead. They practiced small things, touching the halter, lifting hooves, walking in circles, but always at Misty's pace. Grace never forced a thing, and Misty never resisted again. Word of the progress spread like wildfire. Local ranchers, once skeptical, began stopping by with quiet admiration. A woman from the State Wildlife Board requested a visit. Someone from a regional animal sanctuary asked if Grace would consider doing a demonstration. Bennett Stables, once just another dusty fixture on the edge of Springvale, was becoming something else entirely, a living symbol of second chances. And still, Grace remained focused on the only thing that mattered, Misty. Each morning began with the same ritual. Grace would enter the pen, stand still until Misty came to her, then walk the perimeter side by side. No reins, no pressure, just two figures moving in harmony. One morning, as the sun was breaking across the far hills, Misty came trotting across the enclosure as soon as she saw Grace at the gate. It wasn't subtle. It was joy, eagerness. Grace laughed silently, her smile wide, and let her fingers brush against Misty's mane as she passed. Charlotte watched all of this unfold, sometimes in awe, sometimes in disbelief. She found herself sitting by the fence more and more, notebook in hand, sketching quietly. She never said much about it, but the pages began to fill with drawings, not just of Misty, but of Grace, of the bond between them. There was something deeply healing in watching them, something that had begun to thaw even the parts of Charlotte that had once been closed off. One afternoon she handed Grace a drawing without a word. It showed Misty resting with her head against Grace's lap, eyes closed, peaceful. Grace looked at it, then at Charlotte, and for the first time in weeks she spoke, not loudly, not perfectly, but with the kind of clarity that doesn't come from sound, but from understanding. "Thank you." Charlotte blinked. "You can talk?" Grace nodded slowly. "Just not often. Not unless it matters." Charlotte smiled, softer than usual. "Well, that mattered." By the end of the week, something had shifted in the entire town. People no longer came just to see a Mustang be tamed. They came to witness something gentler, rarer, a connection that defied explanation. And Misty, once wild and unreachable, now stood with her head resting against Grace's shoulder like she had been waiting for her all along. Grace knew they weren't done, not by a long shot. There would still be setbacks, still be moments of fear and frustration. But they had crossed a threshold now, and they would face the next steps together. Because the wild wasn't something to be conquered. It was something to be understood, something to be met with patience and empathy. And sometimes all it took was one girl who listened and one Mustang who dared to trust, to show the world that healing wasn't loud. It was quiet. And it started with showing up day after day until the silence between two broken things became something strong enough to carry them both. The sun had barely risen when the silence of the stable was broken by the rhythmic sound of hooves echoing softly through the paddock. Not in panic, not in resistance, but in a steady, purposeful beat that spoke of confidence growing where fear used to live. Misty had begun moving with a fluidity that was new to her, stretching her legs with each stride as though learning her own power again, not in wild bursts of rebellion, but in calm, directed energy. Grace stood just outside the paddock gate, halter in hand, not to demand anything but to offer the same question she asked every morning now: "Are you ready?" And every morning, Misty seemed more certain of her answer. She would approach Grace, not hesitantly but with soft certainty, and dip her head slightly as if to say, "Let's begin." Over the past few days, Grace had introduced something new: movement with purpose. She and Misty had started working on lead exercises, not just walking, but learning to turn together, to stop together, to pivot like dance partners rehearsing for an unspoken performance. The first time Misty halted at Grace's side without the faintest pull of the rope, Frank had let out a low whistle from across the field. "That right there," he muttered to no one in particular. "That's partnership." And it was. It was the beginning of something more than training. It was trust evolving into connection, and connection becoming instinct. That morning, Grace brought Misty into the main paddock, the larger space that bordered the outer trail, something she hadn't done before. It was open, less controlled, with more distractions. A shifting breeze, a pair of crows in the tree line, the scent of something distant on the air. But Misty didn't shy away. She followed Grace into the open space and stood quietly as the halter was removed, her eyes steady, her chest rising and falling with the calm rhythm of a horse who no longer needed to run to feel free. For a few minutes they simply walked. No reins, no ropes. Grace would step left, Misty would mirror. Grace would pause, Misty would stop beside her like a shadow. It wasn't showy, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real. The trail ride had been a lingering idea, a dream unspoken but shared silently between them. The thought of riding Misty had always seemed far off, almost fragile, as if even saying it out loud would break the spell of what they'd built. But now the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Grace had been working daily on groundwork, introducing a saddle pad first, letting Misty sniff it, step away from it, grow used to it on her back with no pressure. Then came the light bareback pad, cinched loosely just enough to rest securely. Misty didn't flinch, she didn't bolt. She turned her head to look at Grace each time, as if checking in. "We're still okay, right?" And every time, Grace would smile gently, brush her fingers through Misty's mane, and let her know they were more than okay. The day Grace introduced the saddle, she did it slowly, layer by layer, step by step. And when Misty finally stood still with the full weight of it across her back, ears forward, breathing slow, Charlotte whispered from behind the fence, "She looks like she's done this before." And maybe she had. Maybe somewhere in her past, before the roundup, before the chaos, she had known hands that were kind and voices that were soft. Or maybe this was simply what it looked like when fear faded and trust filled its place. Walter was there that afternoon, watching quietly from a distance as Grace began practicing mounting. First, just leaning over the saddle, shifting her weight gently, letting Misty feel the motion. Then stepping down, praising her, walking away. No rush, no expectations. The third day of trying, Grace finally swung one leg over and settled gently onto Misty's back. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. Misty's ears flicked, her muscles twitched. But she didn't move away. She stood rooted, solid. Grace sat quietly, not urging her forward, just letting her adjust. And then, slowly, Misty took a step. Then another. It was clumsy at first. The rhythm was unsure, but it was forward. By the end of that week, they were walking full laps of the paddock together, Grace riding bareback with only the halter guiding them. No bit, no pressure, just a quiet agreement between them. Word spread, as it always did in small towns. A couple of local trainers stopped by, some out of curiosity, others out of doubt. One of them, a gruff man named Harlan who'd worked horses his whole life, stood silently by the fence, arms crossed. When Grace dismounted and rubbed Misty's forehead, Harlan nodded once, slowly. "You didn't break her," he said. "You reached her." And that, coming from him, meant more than applause. But Grace wasn't chasing praise. She was chasing peace, for Misty and maybe for herself. Every moment she spent with the mare was healing something old and unspoken in her, something fractured by silence and buried in years of being misunderstood. Misty didn't need words, didn't expect explanations. She just needed presence. And so did Grace. They began walking short trails around the perimeter of the ranch, always with someone nearby at first, Frank or Philip riding behind, just in case. But eventually alone, just the two of them. Misty's stride was sure, her ears attentive but relaxed. Birds took flight, leaves rustled. A fox crossed the path once, and Misty stopped briefly, watched, then continued on without alarm. Grace could feel the shift in her every step, the way her body moved differently now, not with fear, but with intention. The wildness hadn't been taken from her. It had been reshaped, honored, given purpose. Charlotte began coming more often, walking beside them sometimes, talking softly to Misty. She still carried her notebook everywhere, but now the pages were full of more than sketches, poems, phrases, thoughts about trust, healing, even about her mother. One day she handed Grace a folded page that read, "Sometimes the ones we're trying to save end up saving us instead." Grace read it in silence, then tucked it into the pocket of her jacket, where it stayed from that day on. As summer edged closer, the days grew longer, the nights warmer. Grace and Misty spent more time together than apart, and while the world outside continued to spin, full of noise and expectations, within the quiet rhythm of hoofbeats and the steady rise of breath, something rare had taken root. Not just between a girl and a horse, but in everyone who had witnessed their journey. It reminded them that transformation doesn't happen in sudden leaps. It happens in the patient unfolding of trust, in the willingness to show up again and again, in the slow, silent shift from survival to belonging. And so, with each sunrise, Misty walked closer to freedom, not the kind found in open pastures alone, but the kind found in understanding, in partnership, in a bond that said, "I see you, I hear you, you're safe." And Grace, in learning to guide her, had found her own path too, not by speaking louder, but by listening deeper. And in doing so, she had unlocked something wild and beautiful, not just in Misty, but in herself. The wind carried a different kind of stillness that morning, not silence exactly, but a calm, heavy hush that felt like the deep breath before something changes. Grace stood at the edge of the pasture, eyes fixed on the horizon where the trail began to curve into the trees, her fingers absently tracing the worn leather of Misty's halter. The sun had only just started to stretch over the hills, casting long golden shadows across the ranch. Misty stood beside her, the quiet weight of her presence anchoring the moment. There had been dozens of walks, rides, shared silences, but something about today felt different. Not in the way things break, but in the way things are about to open. Frank had sensed it too. He hadn't said much, just a nod at breakfast, his plate barely touched, his mind clearly elsewhere. Even Philip, who usually filled every space with words or movement, had kept his distance, watching from the porch with a stillness that mirrored the air. Charlotte, ever the observer, hadn't brought her sketchbook. Instead, she leaned against the fence, her arms crossed, gaze fixed on Misty, as if trying to memorize every line, every muscle, every breath. There was a collective sense that something unspoken had arrived, like a page turning on its own. Grace stepped forward, Misty following without command, without tension, just a quiet agreement between them. They moved through the gate and onto the trail, one she'd walked dozens of times, but never quite like this. The path curved gently through whispering pines and amber grasses swaying in the early morning breeze. Birds called faintly overhead, but the forest held its own hush, like even the animals knew not to interrupt. Each step felt deliberate, not cautious, but reverent, like the path was holding space for something sacred. The trail ride wasn't a test. It wasn't about showing what Misty could do or proving how far they'd come. It was a ritual, a crossing, a return. Not to a place, but to a state of being that neither of them had touched in a very long time. Grace let the reins hang loosely in her hands. Misty moved at her own rhythm, her hooves pressing softly into the earth, her ears flicking at every sound but her stride never faltering. She wasn't the same horse that had arrived trembling and broken. The wildness was still there, yes, but now it lived beneath the surface like a current. Strong, steady, no longer surging in panic, but guiding her forward with purpose. They passed the old sycamore where Grace used to play as a child, its bark peeled in long strips by years of weather and time. She remembered tying twine around its limbs, pretending it was the mast of a ship. So much had changed since then, inside her more than outside. She had learned the power of stillness, of presence, of asking rather than demanding. The horse beside her wasn't just a project or a challenge, she was a mirror. And in that reflection, Grace had seen her own grief, her own quiet rage, her need to be understood, and her longing to belong, not just to people, but to something deeper, to herself. Up ahead, the trail widened into a clearing Grace remembered well. It had once been a picnic spot, long before her father's illness, before the weight of adulthood settled on her shoulders. She hadn't set foot there since she was a child, but Misty paused at its edge like she knew. Grace slid off gently, landing soft-footed beside her, and together they walked into the open space. The grass shimmered in the breeze, tall and untouched, bending like waves in a sea of gold. Misty lowered her head, grazing lazily, utterly at peace, while Grace sat in the grass, legs crossed, her hand resting on Misty's withers. They stayed like that for a while. No rush, no agenda, just breath and presence. Memories surfaced, fragmented and uninvited. Her mother humming in the kitchen, the sound of horses in the distance, the way her father's voice used to soften when he talked about the land. For the first time in years, those memories didn't hurt. They didn't press like thorns against her chest. They were just there, part of her, and part of this place. The pain hadn't disappeared. It had simply softened, made room for something new. And that newness was born in this bond, in the trust Misty had given her, and the trust she had learned to give in return. Eventually, Grace stood, and Misty followed, walking beside her without hesitation, back along the trail that had brought them here. The return was quieter, deeper somehow, like a circle closing not to end something, but to make it whole. When they reached the paddock again, the others were still there, Frank tipping his hat, Charlotte giving a small, proud smile, and even Philip clapping once, softly, not for show, but out of shared understanding. Grace didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence said enough. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky blushed with the last colors of the day, Grace sat with Misty under the old oak behind the barn. The mare rested her head against Grace's shoulder briefly before turning to graze again, completely at ease. And for the first time in a long time, Grace allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, healing doesn't mean returning to who you were before. Sometimes it means becoming someone new entirely, shaped not in spite of the hurt, but because of the way you chose to move through it. And in Misty's quiet strength, in her wild heart made steady, Grace had found that path, not away from the past, but through it, together. The weather had started to shift, the kind of change that settles in quietly, low clouds dragging across the hills, a pressure in the air that made the horses restless and the humans more alert than usual. Walter stood at the edge of the paddock, arms crossed, watching Misty and Grace complete their slow, rhythmic walk around the perimeter. It was their fourth time that week working outside the confines of the pen, and each day Misty grew more confident. Her ears flicked but didn't flatten, her muscles stayed loose instead of tense, and most importantly, she stayed connected to Grace even when birds took flight or the wind shifted suddenly. But today was going to be different. Today, Grace had something else in mind. She had been up late the night before, hunched over her notebook by the dim light of her desk lamp, sketching and writing out ideas in the same soft pencil that had documented Misty's every movement for weeks. Her mind had been buzzing with a mix of anticipation and quiet nerves. Not the anxious kind, something deeper, more personal. She had decided that Misty's progress needed to mean more than just a festival performance. She wanted to test if Misty's ability to connect could extend beyond her, beyond the bubble of trust they'd built. She wanted to invite others in, not to challenge Misty, but to show her the world was bigger and kinder than it used to be. And so that morning, while the clouds gathered over Springvale, Grace stood beside Misty in the paddock, notebook in hand, and waited for her guests to arrive. Dylan was the first. He came with his mom, hands shoved in his hoodie pockets, his sneakers already muddy from cutting through the fields. He nodded at Grace, a little shy now, not the same boy who used to call her weird under his breath. Misty lifted her head as they approached, but didn't move away. Grace handed Dylan a note she'd written earlier. "Try standing at the fence first. Let her come to you." Dylan obeyed, leaning awkwardly against the wooden rail, not quite sure what to expect. Misty watched him for a moment, then resumed grazing. For 5 minutes, nothing happened. Then, slowly, Misty wandered closer, her steps careful but not hesitant. She stopped about 5 feet from the fence, ears forward, eyes on Dylan, not Grace, and then she stepped closer. Dylan didn't move. His breathing was shallow, but he didn't flinch. Misty sniffed the air between them and then dipped her head slightly. Grace held her breath. That moment, small and quiet as it was, meant everything, because Misty had made the choice. She had decided Dylan was safe. Later that afternoon, Charlotte brought her friend Bella, a girl who had never been around horses and didn't know how to act. Grace handed her a similar note. "No sudden movements. Speak softly or not at all." Bella tried, though her nervousness showed. She clutched the fence post like it was a lifeline and kept glancing at Grace for reassurance. This time Misty took longer to approach. She circled wide, sniffing the breeze, her tail swishing. She wasn't sure about Bella, and Grace could see that. So she stepped forward herself, kneeling down in the grass about 10 feet away, her body language relaxed, head down, sketchbook open. Misty, seeing that signal of calm, exhaled audibly and moved toward Grace first, brushing against her shoulder before turning to examine Bella again. It was Grace's calm that grounded the mare, and soon Misty was standing near enough that Bella could offer a trembling hand. She didn't try to touch, just offered it. And for a second, Misty didn't back away. That was enough. Word spread quickly, as it always did in small towns. Grace's quiet training was becoming something people wanted to witness, not just because it was impressive, but because it felt rare, honest, healing. The mare even stopped by unannounced, standing stiffly by the barn with her hands folded, watching Grace and Misty work together from a distance. She didn't say much, just muttered, "Seems the horse isn't quite as wild as folks thought." And then she left, her car tires crunching over gravel as the clouds above darkened. By midweek, the forecast called for storms, the kind that could wash out trails and flood the low barns if they weren't careful. Walter started securing tarps and moving supplies, barking instructions with the edge of a man trying to stay ahead of nature's plans. Philip muttered about how no good could come from trusting spring skies. But Grace, ever calm, ever certain, kept working with Misty, adjusting their schedule, shortening the walks, staying close to the barn, but never skipping a day. Then, on a Thursday evening, just after the sun dipped below the hills and the first heavy drops of rain began to fall, Misty did something that made Grace pause. She nudged the gate to the barn with her nose, not as a nervous reaction, but as if suggesting it was time to go inside. Grace opened it, and Misty stepped in without a lead rope, without coaxing, and stood in her stall, waiting. Grace's eyes stung, not because of the rain, but because Misty had made that choice too, because Misty wasn't just reacting anymore. She was participating, engaging, trusting not just one person, but the space around her. Inside the barn, as the rain grew heavier and thunder began to roll low in the distance, Misty stayed calm. The other horses shifted, snorted, kicked at their stalls. Misty stayed still. Grace stood beside her, stroking her shoulder, her touch light and rhythmic. It struck Walter, watching from the doorway, that the storm outside was nothing compared to the one Grace had weathered inside herself over the years. And now, standing with a once wild horse during a thunderstorm, she was calmer than most adults he knew. Grace wasn't just training Misty, she was teaching the rest of them what it meant to be steady. That night, with lightning forking across the hills and wind howling through the barn rafters, Misty rested with her head just inches from Grace's shoulder. Grace didn't leave. She curled up on a blanket of hay in the stall, her notebook tucked under her arm, Misty's breath warm and even in the close dark. It wasn't just trust anymore, it was connection, something unshakable, something unspoken but unmistakably real. And when morning came, still gray, still wet, Misty stepped out into the new day with Grace beside her, not hesitating even once. The day of the festival arrived cloaked in the kind of golden haze that only late spring can offer. Soft light pouring over the hills, dew still clinging to blades of grass, and the air thick with a tension that wasn't quite fear, but something close. Springvale hadn't seen an event like this in years. What had once been a sleepy tradition, barely more than a handful of food stalls and a few rides, had turned into something else entirely. All because of a girl and a horse the town had once whispered about for all the wrong reasons. Now they whispered for other reasons, words like miracle, connection, healing. The rumor that Grace and Misty would be making an appearance had drawn a crowd larger than anyone expected, swelling the fairgrounds with locals and visitors alike, all curious, all waiting for something they couldn't quite define. Walter stood near the gate, hands on his hips, scanning the crowd with an expression that looked like impatience, but was really worry in disguise. He didn't like attention, he didn't like noise, and most of all, he didn't like the idea that the fragile thread of trust between Grace and Misty might snap under pressure. Grace, on the other hand, was calm, more calm than anyone else there, including Misty. She had spent the morning brushing the mare's coat until it gleamed like burnished bronze, her fingers moving with a steady rhythm that Misty had come to associate with safety. And when it was time to load her into the trailer, Misty didn't fight. She stepped up with just a brief pause, like she needed 1 second to take a breath, then moved forward as if it had always been part of the plan. The trailer pulled into the fairgrounds without fanfare, but eyes turned anyway. Children tugged on their parents' sleeves. Teenagers took out their phones. Older residents, the ones who remembered the fire, the chaos, the stories about the wild horse that couldn't be tamed, watched with narrowed eyes and half-held breath. Grace walked Misty down the ramp, one hand on the lead, her posture tall but relaxed. Misty's ears twitched, her nostrils flared, but she didn't spook, not even when a balloon popped in the distance or when a group of boys laughed too loud near the food stalls. She blinked, lifted her head and looked around, assessing, not reacting. And Grace smiled, just barely. They led her to the center of the ring that had been set up with a simple rope barrier. No tricks, no jumps, just an open space surrounded by benches and folding chairs. The announcer, a local volunteer with a warm voice and a slightly wrinkled program in hand, didn't introduce Grace with fanfare. He just said, "Up next is a young woman many of you know, and a horse you've heard plenty about. They've got something to show us, not a performance, just a story told without words." And then he stepped back, giving them the space they needed. Grace took a breath. Not a nervous one, not a forced one, a grounding breath. She walked Misty to the center, unclipped the lead, and stepped back. And Misty didn't bolt, she didn't freeze, she stayed. Her head turned to Grace, then to the crowd. Her body relaxed, and then, slowly, gracefully, she began to move. Not in circles, not in chaos, but in a smooth, gliding arc around Grace, a rhythm they'd built over months. At first, the crowd didn't understand. They expected more, expected rearing or tricks, but as Misty moved, her ears flicking back to Grace, her pace perfectly matching the girl's breath and gestures, something else started to settle over the field. A quiet, a reverence, the kind of hush that happens when people realize they're witnessing something not loud but deeply meaningful. Then Grace stopped moving. She simply stood still. And Misty stopped too, right beside her. Not because she was told, not because she was trained to, but because she chose to. She lowered her head, pressed her soft muzzle gently into Grace's shoulder, and stood there. It lasted for seconds that felt like minutes. And then came the applause. Not thunderous, not explosive, but steady, respectful, honest. But what happened next was something Grace could never have planned. A child, no more than 6 or 7, quiet, holding their mother's hand, stepped forward through the rope. Everyone froze. Walter stood like he might leap over the fence, but Grace simply turned, nodded slightly, and opened her hand. The child came forward, eyes wide, moving carefully. Misty watched, alert but not alarmed. The child didn't reach to pet, just stood there. And Misty, after a few seconds, stepped forward. One step, then another, then lowered her head so the child could touch her cheek. It wasn't a trick. It wasn't trained. It was trust, shared freely between two beings who understood more than words could explain. After that, everything changed. The crowd didn't rush the fence. They didn't need to. People began to understand what they were really seeing. Not a show, but a possibility. That healing is real. That trust is possible, even after trauma. That with patience, even the most broken spirits can be mended. Not by force, not by dominance, but by listening, by presence, by love. By the time they loaded Misty back into the trailer, the sun was dipping low, casting the field in a copper glow. Grace looked exhausted but radiant. She didn't speak much afterward, didn't need to. The town spoke for her. People approached not with questions, but with thanks, with stories of their own fears, their own losses, their own longing for connection. What Grace had done with Misty reached beyond horses. It reached people. It reminded them that change is slow, messy, and often invisible, until it's not. Until one day it stands in the middle of a field, in front of hundreds of people, and shows the world what healing actually looks like. That night, long after the fairgrounds had emptied and the last booth was packed away, Walter sat on the porch with a quiet drink in hand and watched as Grace led Misty out into the pasture under a sky heavy with stars. No halter, no rope, just the two of them, and Misty followed, step for step, into the dark, like she always would. It had been 6 months since the festival, and the rhythm of life in Springvale had begun to change in ways both quiet and profound. What had started as curiosity about a girl, a horse, a story too tender to be true, had grown into something else entirely. Word had spread beyond the county lines, through neighboring towns, through school districts, through online forums and quiet conversations in feed stores and veterinary clinics. People began arriving in Springvale not to gawk, not to spectate, but to learn, to listen, and sometimes to heal. What Grace and Misty had built was no longer just a bond between girl and horse. It had become a sanctuary for others seeking the same kind of connection, honest, unforced, transformative. Walter, reluctant as ever to change, found himself fielding phone calls from strangers who didn't speak like reporters or opportunists. They spoke like people who had been broken in some way and wanted to believe in the possibility of repair. And while Walter grumbled and grunted and acted as though it was all a bother, Grace knew better. She saw the way he cleaned up the barn before guests arrived, how he left fresh coffee on the porch, how he lingered nearby, pretending to fix a fence while quietly listening to the stories being shared in the fields below. It wasn't long before Grace had more horses under her care than she'd ever imagined. Some came from local farms where they'd been misunderstood or mishandled. Others were rescues, pulled from auctions or surrendered by overwhelmed owners who couldn't offer the time or patience their animals needed. Each one came with its own wounds, some visible, others buried deep beneath skittish eyes and defensive behavior. But Grace had learned something vital in her journey with Misty. You don't demand trust, you earn it. And so she worked with them one by one, not training them, not forcing them into obedience, but meeting them where they were, showing up day after day until one by one they began to soften. Not every horse would become like Misty. That was never the point. The point was giving them a chance, letting them choose connection over fear, letting them remember what it was to feel safe. And the humans came too, veterans with haunted eyes who found comfort just being near the horses, children with trauma too big for their small frames who found the courage to speak again after brushing a horse's mane, families who had fractured under pressure and slowly found ways to stitch themselves back together while volunteering to clean stalls or help mend fences. Grace didn't call it therapy. She didn't label it anything at all. She just opened the gate and said, "Come if you want to. Stay if it helps." And somehow that was enough. Misty remained at the heart of it all. She'd changed too. Her body had healed strong and sleek again, but it was her mind, her spirit, that had grown most. She no longer flinched at loud sounds or unfamiliar people. She carried herself with the quiet strength of an animal that had survived the worst and come out the other side, not just intact, but wiser. She had become something of a guide to the newer horses, often the first to approach a trembling new arrival, her calm presence acting like a balm. And with people, she was still cautious, still selective, but when she chose to connect, it meant something. It changed them. You could see it in their faces, like something long dormant had been stirred awake. As the seasons shifted from summer to autumn, the fields turned golden and the air grew sharp with the scent of dry leaves and hay. Grace often walked the pasture at dusk, Misty trailing behind or beside her, depending on her mood. Those walks became sacred, moments to breathe, to reflect, to marvel at how far they'd come. Sometimes Walter would join them, walking in companionable silence. Other times they'd talk about horses, about life, about pain, and how it carves you into something stronger if you let it. And then came a letter. It arrived with no return address, the handwriting small and neat. Inside was a simple message. "I heard what you're doing. I didn't know where else to turn. I lost my daughter 2 years ago. I don't want to lose myself too." Attached was a photo of a gaunt Appaloosa gelding, bones jutting out under patchy hair, eyes clouded with something more than age. Grace didn't hesitate. She wrote back, "Bring him. We'll see what we can do." That letter wasn't the last. More followed. And though Grace never advertised, never made anything official, the word continued to spread. Not about miracles, not about magic, but about a place where broken things weren't discarded, where patience was more valuable than skill, where love was a quiet, constant act, shown in early mornings, in late-night check-ins, in the way Grace stood beside a frightened horse for hours without touching it, just breathing, waiting, letting trust find its own way. Years later, when people talked about what Springvale had become, they didn't mention the festival or the headlines. They talked about how it felt to stand in that field, how it smelled like cedar and earth and something else, something old and steady. They talked about the silence between words, about the way Misty looked at you like she knew exactly what you were holding inside, about Grace, who never promised anything but always delivered the one thing that mattered most, the belief that healing was not only possible, but already underway. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howled across the hills and the barns groaned under snow, Grace would sit with Misty in her stall, their breath rising in quiet clouds, and think about that first day, the fire, the fear, the uncertainty. It felt like a lifetime ago, and in many ways it was, because from that wreckage, From that moment of near total loss, they had built something unshakable, something real, something that would last.